Welcome to the Fragility Forum 2022 podcast series produced by the Fragility, Conflict and Violence Group of the World Bank Group. As complexity and uncertainty become the new normal, with complex crises posing new challenges, from the COVID-19 pandemic to climate change, this podcast series explores how the international community can best support countries affected by fragility, conflict and violence in a fast-changing global landscape.
Hi everyone, I hope you are doing well. I am delighted to be here hosting this important podcast episode for the Fragility Forum, #Fragility Forum 2022, titled Taking the Pulse of Business in Fragile and Conflict-Affected Situations to Support Private Sector Recovery from COVID-19. My name is Alexandre Laure. I am a Senior Private Sector Specialist with the World Bank Group Finance, Competitiveness and Innovation Global Practice. Today, I am joined by two World Bank colleagues to speak about COVID-19 Business Pulse Surveys, or BPS in short, being conducted in FCV country during the COVID-19 pandemic. The first speaker is Artie Grover, a senior economist, and the second speaker is Asta Beresaita, a senior private sector specialist. In this episode, we will see why monitoring the impact of COVID-19 on private sector is important, highlight firms' coping mechanism, review challenges of conducting BPS in fragile and conflict-affected situations, and how Business Pulse survey results inform government policy responses. This will be structured around 5 questions. Now the floor is for our speakers for a short round of introduction.
I am Artie Grover, and I'm a senior economist in the firm's Entrepreneurship and Innovation Unit. I have worked on FCV countries in a number of contexts. So for the analytical work, I have been involved in Afghanistan, Sudan, South Sudan, and Ethiopia. And for lending operations, I have been working on Comoros, Nigeria, and Mozambique.
Thank you. My name is Asta Beresaita. I'm a senior private sector specialist with the East Africa team. I'm currently based in Nairobi, Kenya, and I've been focusing on financial and private sector development work in FCV countries, currently working in Somalia and Sudan, and in the past I have also worked in Iraq and Ethiopia.
What is COVID-19 Business Pulse survey and how the COVID-19 Business Pulse survey data and analytics can inform policymaking in FCV countries?
The COVID-19 shock has evolved from a health emergency into a global economic crisis. Unlike previous global shocks, it has affected most countries simultaneously through multiple transmission channels. As a result, while some learnings from previous crises have proven useful in the initial response phase, policymakers and development practitioners have been faced with an acute lack of data and evidence on how to design and implement support policies. In order to address this gap, the World Bank developed COVID-19 Business Pulse surveys, which we call BPS for short. These are rapid modular phone surveys directed to enterprises covering all range in size and sectors. The BPS data are being collected in several waves. The first round of data collection took place during May to September 2020 in 51 countries, covering all World Bank regions and a wide range of country characteristics. Currently, we are running the fourth wave of the BPS. BPS is usually implemented in collaboration with national statistical offices, even in fragile countries such as Sudan. Together with the World Bank's enterprise surveys, 16 FCV countries implemented the first round of the survey, and 6 of them have gone through another round after that. BPS uses a standardized questionnaire to capture the effects of the pandemic on firms. It also collects information on firms' adjustment strategies and their access to public support programs to mitigate the effects of the pandemic. These surveys are informing the design of existing lending operations in countries such as Comoros, as well as emergency COVID response lending in countries such as Nigeria. The data sheds light on the vulnerability and viability aspects of firms and can provide information on supporting them, for example, by facilitating access to finance and skills. The BPS has the flexibility to also accommodate customized modules such as that on informality, trade, and the training needs of the firms in terms of their management capabilities and technology readiness. The information provided by these additional modules are informing concrete and targeted policy support to firms that can help them cope with the crisis in the short term and then help them recover and become more resilient in the long term.
Thank you, Arti. This was very insightful. Now I'll turn to Asta. What are the challenges in collecting data in FCV location, and how those challenges were managed in Sudan and Somalia based on your experience?
In FCV countries like Somalia and Sudan, what we often face is incomplete, often very outdated, and not always reliable data. And as Arti highlighted, these challenges are very prevalent in other FCV countries as well. There are two key challenges to data collection that I would like to highlight. First, we face very weak and often nascent institutions, including national bureaus of statistics that lack financial and human resources, as well as expertise to conduct data collection activities. Prevalence of informality further complicates data collection efforts due to challenges in developing reliable sampling frames. Second, we also have limitations presented by the security challenges. Oftentimes, it is very costly, if not impossible, to conduct data collection in all of these countries. And to overcome these challenges, I think it is critical to be realistic and balance the levels of ambition with pragmatism. For example, sample frames are not always the universe of firms. Building partnerships with other development partners as well as private sector organizations, as we have done in Somalia, partnering with UNIDO and Chamber of Commerce, can also help leverage additional channels to boost firm survey responsiveness. Finally, I stress that it is critical to dedicate sufficient resources, use technology to our best, and have realistic timelines to conduct data collection in FCV countries.
Thank you, Asa, for spelling out those challenges in getting data in FCS. I'll turn back to Arti to understand what has been the impact of COVID on firms in FCV country, and how would you compare those impacts to other countries?
Thank you, Alex, for your question. The COVID-19 pandemic halted the global economy in a multitude of ways, from disruptions in supply chain to demand-side frictions induced by lockdown measures. Businesses all over the world were affected. A question that we are often asked is whether the impact of the crisis was more severe in fragile countries than in other countries, and if the coping strategies of the firms differ in the two contexts. Using the BPS data, we estimate the effects of COVID-19 on firms separately for FCV and non-FCV countries. After accounting for differences in the country, firm, sector-specific attributes, we have 4 stylized facts on firms in fragile environments during the COVID-19 pandemic. Number 1, the pandemic has more protracted and persistent effects on FCV countries. Firms are recovering from the COVID-19 crisis, but it is far from the pre-pandemic level. We are possibly experiencing a U-shaped recovery pattern, which is even slower in FCV countries. For example, immediately following the shock, sales in non-FCV countries fell by 39% compared to 47% in FCV locations. In the latest round of the BPS dataset, sales still remain 36% below their pre-pandemic levels in FCV countries compared to 27% in non-FCV countries. Overall, although firms in the group of FCV countries are showing signs of recovery, it is much more sluggish relative to those in other countries. Number two, firms in non-FCV countries adjust largely by reducing hours worked, wages and salaries, and less so by laying off workers. By comparison, firms in FCV countries are more likely to fire workers in response to the pandemic. Now, why so? At the onset of the crisis, firms in FCV countries, for example, had an average of 5 weeks of cash in hand to cover their operating expenses compared to 11 weeks for an average firms in non-FCV country. So the extent of business uncertainty was also higher in FCV countries compared to others. Responding to these operational realities, firms in FCV countries are adjusting by shedding jobs. This also means that some of the intangible firm-worker relationships have been lost in FCV countries, which would be hard to rebuild post-pandemic. Number three, firms in FCV countries are narrowing the digital adoption gap with non-FCV countries. Specifically, the likelihood to start or increase the use of digital technologies grew from 16% to 39% in FCV countries between the first and the latest round of data collection. This improvement is impressive. However, when it comes to making new investment in digital solutions, firms in FCV countries severely lag behind. This may point to a lack of access to credit or firms' assessment of their needs to upgrade capabilities. Notably, firms with structured management practices in FCV countries are also comparably likely to adopt digital solutions and invest in digitalization as much as their counterparts in non-FCV locations. Number four, the probability of accessing public support for firms in FCV countries remains very low. It is about 22% in the latest round of data collection. This likelihood has barely increased since the initial phase of the crisis. By comparison, for firms in non-FCV locations, the probability of accessing public support increased from 31% to 41% as the pandemic evolved. Public support to firms has the potential to address gaps in management practices, access to credit, and to upgrade other capabilities.
Thank you so much, Arti. So we can see that there has been a big impact on firms and somehow positive message in addressing the digital divide. I'll turn to Asta. Can you please tell us what are the ground level details that testify to the poor performance and lower resilience of firms in FCV countries?
Thank you. The challenges that Arti presented are not surprising, given the challenging business environment that firms are facing in FCV countries such as Somalia and Sudan. In these countries, the firms operate in very difficult settings, facing skill shortages, poor infrastructure and supply chains, and severe lack of financial intermediation. In addition, political instability, high levels of insecurity, and lack of rule of law pose a significant toll on firm performance and resilience. Furthermore, unfortunately, in addition to COVID-19, FCV countries are more vulnerable to experiencing multiple shocks at the same time. For example, in Somalia, in addition to COVID-19, firms were also simultaneously impacted by climate-related crises, namely locusts and severe droughts. Another big difference between the firms operating in FCV countries and those in more advanced economies is the level of public support that was offered to help weather the crisis. While in developed countries, many firms could benefit from large government economic stimulus programs, in countries like Sudan and Somalia, where fiscal space and public capacity to implement large-scale support programs was already severely limited before the pandemic, firms were largely left to their own devices. For example, what we see in Somalia, that a year and a half into the pandemic, only 3% of the firms reported receiving any government support. Lack of this support also comes out very strongly in our day-to-day interactions with the private sector firms and other stakeholders in FCV countries. Finally, I would also like to highlight the limited access to finance that Arti has also mentioned in her remarks as another very acute challenge that both policymakers and private sector highlighted in our ongoing interactions as a key challenge to firm resilience in these countries.
Thank you, Asa. So as we wrap up this very interesting podcast, I would like you, Arti and Asta, to leave to the audience some important lesson. What are the lessons supporting firms in other countries that can be applied to the FCV location, and how should the World Bank advice be tailored to fragile context?
As Asta pointed out in the beginning of the podcast, that one of the main challenges in FCV locations is the lack of reliable data. The first and foremost lesson is that within a short time span, the BPS initiative was successful in collecting meaningful data in fragile contexts. And initiatives such as the BPS may be particularly appropriate for FCV countries due to ease of data collections. As you recall, these are phone surveys vis-a-vis face-to-face surveys. They also have relatively quick turnaround time, on an average of about 15 to 20 minutes per survey, and they come at a much lower cost than face-to-face surveys. Thus, data gaps that are binding in normal circumstances can be overcome with such efforts to inform policy which are evidence-backed. Second, based on the analysis of BPS data comparing FCV with non-FCV countries and other research using global BPS data, we recommend that policy support to firms can focus on facilitating the 3 C's. Number 1, capabilities of firms, such as management practices and technology readiness. This matters for firms' response to the crisis, especially as the analysis from the BPS data shows that management practices are equally important in FCV as in non-FCV locations. Number 2, capital or access to credit to invest in digitalization or upgrading. This is important for firms to cope with the crisis and to recover from it, and given that FCVs lag behind in digital investments. Number 3, connections with other firms. Recent work on globally engaged firms using BPS data suggests that firms with such a network recover faster. Now, tailoring these recommendations further will require an in-depth understanding of each FCV context, which may vary across countries. Notably, firms in fragile contexts face multiple constraints. To this end, I would suggest that support should alleviate multiple constraints either simultaneously or sequentially, for instance, using a funneling approach to filter out the most promising firms. The second point that I want to say is that given the low institutional capacity in FCV situations that Asta alluded to, support should be simple. Some examples include encouraging the adoption of basic management practices, such as keeping track of performance and targets or modernizing record keeping. Other examples include the use of digital platforms for sales or using social media for marketing and so on. Although these recommendations may sound similar across countries, the modality of support, the kind of activities supported, and the type of firms targeted are tailored as per the context of fragility.
Thank you, Arti. So I will first start by a more broader observation, just to say that private sector in FCV countries has an even more critical role to play in creating employment, providing services, and driving the overall development agenda. And therefore, efforts to create an enabling environment for private sector-led growth are really widely recognized as a priority, both by policymakers and development practitioners in these complex countries. Now, specifically on lessons learned, I would like to complement the points raised by Arti. I'd like to highlight that in practice, one key challenge in fragile countries is to balance the longer-term objectives of strengthening institutions and business environment reforms with shorter-term imperatives to provide tangible micro-level support to businesses. These early wins could really go a long way in strengthening trust between the private sector and state actors, which is often acutely lacking in countries like Somalia and Sudan. Secondly, efforts should be focused on leveraging very limited public resources to de-risk private investments. For example, in Somalia, one of our projects is supporting a new Apex MSME financing facility that is designed to attract private investment to help address severe access to finance constraints faced by the firms in productive sectors such as livestock, energy, fisheries, and agriculture. Artie's point about strengthening firm capabilities also very much resonates with what we're seeing on the ground. Learning from the early years of the MSME financing facility in Somalia, we found that demand-side interventions are also necessary to help firms improve their operational processes, managerial skills, and also enhance technology adoption. Finally, I will conclude with another broader observation and will say that it is really important to build in flexibility in all programs in FCV countries to allow for course correction and adaptation in very fast changing circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you very much both for your time. It was a great session. I think that the audience will have good insight about our work monitoring the impact of COVID-19 on firms, as well as the type of policy recommendation that our client countries can implement.
This wraps up this episode of the podcast series. Thank you for listening, and please check out our other podcasts. For that, and to learn more about the World Bank Group efforts in environments affected by fragility, conflict, and violence, please visit our website www.worldbank.org/FCV.